WCLN 1170 Radio and Star Vision Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The name of the show is We Should Know, and we appreciate you looking at us today on the Star Vision Channel 16 TV channel. Also, WCLN 1170 AM. As you know, we're there on Tuesdays, 2:30 to 3:30, 7 p.m. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Channel 16 Star Vision. Also, there's a summation reprint in the Sampson Weekly newspaper. We'll upload it to YouTube, so couple of weeks out or a few days out after this show airs, you possibly will see it on YouTube if you go to YouTube and just type in We Should Know EDU. Also, continue to send us your emails and make comments. We do appreciate that. It helps us drive the opinion and direction of where we go with this show. And it's called We Should Know EDU at gmail.com. That's We Should Know EDU at gmail.com. Today we have a very interesting person that's got an unbelievable background, always an interesting guy to be around. Some of you may have seen him on NC Spin on Channel 5. John Hood is the president, chairman of the John Locke Foundation, Raleigh, North Carolina, author of about 6 books, syndicated in a number of newspapers, very much on top of key issues here in North Carolina. And as I told somebody a while back, I was telling them I was going to have you back on again. Of course, you've been down here and visited Clinton a number of times. But there's one thing for sure. You do have an opinion about things. Oftentimes, folks will say, well, I'm not sure I have an opinion. But you have an opinion. Talk to us about John Hood, and then talk to us a bit about the John Locke Foundation, because I know you were very much instrumental in that whole development of that nonprofit organization, also referred to as a think tank, the John Locke Foundation, and I guess some kind of a statistical guide for a lot of folks when they start looking at issues facing government and the public.
Well, appreciate the opportunity to be with you. The John Locke Foundation is a think tank, and I'll try to describe a little bit about what that means. I also would agree with you that I have opinions on almost anything, but the one thing that I will watch with some interest but have no real opinion about or even have a preference for is sports. So do not ask me a sports question. I might not know the answer, and I certainly don't care very much about it.
Well, you're in good company. You're in good company then. I can kind of go along with that.
I'm from North Carolina. I'm from Mecklenburg County. I actually grew up in rural Mecklenburg County. There used to be a place like that, just like rural Wake County. There used to be such a place until the city sort of burgeoned and took over everything. Went to high school there, went to Chapel Hill for my college years, and decided pretty early, in fact, when I was in high school, I was editor of the newspaper there, and really enjoyed it, and decided that I wanted to go into journalism and communications as a career. So when I went to Chapel Hill, I majored in journalism and philosophy, and I started a student magazine there called the Carolina Critic. This was in the mid-'80s. Eventually, we published editions of the student magazine at Chapel Hill, at North Carolina State, in Raleigh, at UNC Greensboro, UNC Charlotte, and Wake Forest in Winston-Salem. Our interest was in bringing students together to write about state and national issues. We had mostly conservative or libertarian students participating, but we also had a few liberals just to spice things up and have some fun debates. And we published that magazine for a number of years. In fact, a version of that magazine is still published at UNC Chapel Hill. It's called the Carolina Review. So the student journalism days really led to my interest in doing this as a career. Spent some time in Washington, both before and after I got out of college. I spent a year at the New Republic, which is a political magazine in Washington. This was right at the tail end of the Reagan administration. I was interested in the interaction between the new President Bush and Congress, and did some work on Capitol Hill. And I also, as part of my duties at the New Republic, advised and assisted a couple of their senior editors with their television show. And this was Fred Barnes and Morton Kondracki. They were on a TV show on public TV called The McLaughlin Group. And so I got my first experience with television being involved in the production side of the McLaughlin Group and seeing how that was done, seeing how the guests were prepped, how the issues were chosen. And some years later, when some colleagues and I got together to create this North Carolina program, NC Spin, I really borrowed a lot from my McLaughlin Group experience. In fact, it looked and felt a lot like the McLaughlin Group when we first started NC Spin. The only difference is we didn't shout quite as much.
The opinions were not quite as boisterous, should we say?
No, I mean, they were strongly felt, but we were Southerners and we were more genteel.
There you go.
But anyway, so I was very much interested in Washington at the time in national politics, but fairly quickly I decided I wanted to come back to North Carolina to do my work. So I came back in 1989. We created and opened in 1990 the John Locke Foundation. My idea was that North Carolina really needed a political magazine, sort of like a National Review or New Republic type of magazine for North Carolina, and that's what I wanted to do. And I also wanted to write newspaper columns and things of that nature. Also had a friend who wanted to create a think tank to do public policy research, hire economists and political scientists and other folks with advanced degrees to study education policy or transportation or taxes, issue reports, advise the legislature. So that was another friend of mine. His name was Art Pope, who became politically prominent later. A third friend was a fellow named Mark Rotterman. He had been involved in politics for many years and was interested in bringing speakers to North Carolina who would be nationally known and have speaking events in Raleigh, Charlotte, other cities. So we kind of married all these ideas together to create the John Locke Foundation, which has a think tank arm that issues reports and studies on government issues, has a publication, Carolina Journal, and a series of other radio, television, and online media products. And we do events and outreach programs. We have an event somewhere in North Carolina at least once a week. It could be a small group discussion. It could be a major event with 600 people watching a nationally known speaker. It could be a debate. Sometimes we host or co-host gubernatorial debates. I did a number of those in the 2008 and 2012 cycle. So we do a lot of different kinds of things. But our goal is, first of all, to focus on North Carolina. That's what we do. We don't do the national debt or the foreign policy, the war in Iraq, that sort of I'm interested in these issues. That's not what we do at the Locke Foundation. And the other thing we're focused on is trying to advance the principles upon which we were founded, which is individual liberty, limited government, free markets. We believe that's the path forward for North Carolina. That's the way to create progress in our state, make our economy more competitive, allow more people opportunities to get up the rungs of the income ladder. So that's what we're committed to, is North Carolina, and to the principles of competition, innovation, personal freedom, and personal responsibility that we think should infuse any progressive 21st century government.
Absolutely. John, again, I want to thank you for being here. And I'm going to hold up your latest book, and it's called First and Freedom. This book really is not necessarily a how-to guide, but it's an information guide. Literally anybody interested in maybe going into government, it would be a good read for them. Tell us about why you did this book and what the important pieces of the book is that you think that folks need to know. And more than that, I guess they can pick this book up online or any of the bookstores.
You can. First and Freedom is the latest John Locke Foundation book. We haven't published a lot of books. I've written a lot of books separately. I was interested. Basically, I like to write books when I'm interested in the subject and I want to learn more about it. So actually what I like more than anything else is the research before I write the book. Then I have to actually write it. So someone else will read it, so they'll pay me. But what I actually enjoy doing is the research, because I'm just that nerdy. I hate to break it to you, but I actually like to learn things. So I wrote a book. One time I wrote a book about the history and economics of advertising. Someone asked me, why in the world did you do that? I said, well, because I didn't know about it and I wanted to learn about it. But in this particular case, in 2011, my colleagues and I at the Locke Foundation, knowing that there would likely be a change of power in Raleigh and thinking through North Carolina's challenges, we decided that a series of 2 books would help to set the stage for a reform agenda for the state. So in 2012, I wrote a book called Our Best Foot Forward, of course playing off of the Tar Heel imagery for North Carolina. And Our Best Foot Forward was really an analysis of our economy, a discussion of what makes state economies grow, and an investment plan for how to make North Carolina more economically competitive. So we published that in 2012. A natural follow-up to that book was a book that got into the nitty-gritty, into the details of how would we reform the education system, how would we reform the tax system, how would we reform the regulatory system, how would we reorganize North Carolina's government. So we decided to put that in the form of a book called First in Freedom, playing off of the symbolism on North Carolina's state flag and logo, that North Carolina was one of the leaders in advancing the cause of American independence in 1775-76. So we're an important part of that story. I would also argue, by the way, not too much of a side note, that North Carolina was where the American Revolution was won, because the British invaded the South. They thought that would be their strategy for victory. They were defeated by a series of battles and skirmishes in North Carolina, which is the reason why Cornwallis had to run away to Virginia and get surrounded.
Right.
So North Carolina has a great history of freedom, but recently we haven't been living up to it, in my view. So we decided to lay out an agenda for free people to pursue, to create more freedom and therefore more prosperity in North Carolina. And that's what First in Freedom is about.
So the book's grounded in historical fact.
It is.
And it gives present-day value because you transcend that and lay out a plan of workable solutions that can actually be played out.
We set the book up as a series of chapters that are led off by references to North Carolina historical figures. People always don't know the important politicians and thinkers and philosophers who come from North Carolina. For example, a very popular conservative newspaper columnist is Thomas Sowell. He writes a nationally syndicated column. He's written dozens of books. He's a very famous economist. He's from Gastonia. We also had Richard Weaver, who was a very popular conservative thinker years ago, who was from Weaverville near Asheville. And he wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences, the title of which has been really popular for 50 years. People always say, you know, ideas have consequences. They're quoting a North Carolinian, Richard Weaver. And we decided to talk about Richard Weaver and Thomas Sowell and Andrew Jackson and other people from North Carolina and take inspiration from them.
Okay. Well, we're going to take our first break, John, and we'll be back in a moment with this very interesting discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We're talking with John Hood of the John Locke Foundation out of Raleigh, a think tank, author of a numerous number of books, one of which we showed you a while ago, First in Freedom. We'll continue this discussion in a moment, so stay with us, and we'll be back in a moment with We Should Know right here on WCLN and Star Vision Channel 16. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. You're listening to We Should Know on WCLN 1170 AM radio, Star Vision Channel 16. If you're watching us, also YouTube, We Should Know EDU. Email us at weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. We're talking with John Hood, the chairman. Actually, I wanted to say chairman of the board, but I'll just say chairman of the John Locke Foundation, but author as well, a number of books. We just talked about your book, First in Freedom. John, this is the latest publication out from the John Locke Foundation. Been involved in everything from politics to public service to all kinds of issues here in North Carolina, and have a very deep-seated history of understanding how our history impacts our present situation. I want to try to transition, if I can, and talk about some of the things that we're looking at today. And I guess from where I'm sitting, I hear a lot of conversation, and I know you do statewide, but I'm seeing that a lot of the magnification, I hear these same kinds of things throughout the state, and one of the subjects that always comes to mind is immigration and its impact here in North Carolina. We've talked about this to a number of our local legislative representatives, because we do have, especially in eastern North Carolina, a huge number of immigrants that are working in farm labor, agriculture, other parts of the state. As you know, it's hospitality industry. Where are we headed in North Carolina when we look at immigration? I'm just going to throw three things on the table that maybe we can kick around. One of them, immigration, as it relates to education, health care, and employment.
Well, I think that we got to recognize that fundamentally the immigration flow occurs because people leave where they currently reside, which could be Mexico, it could be Venezuela, it could be Vietnam, it could be wherever, Canada. They could come to North Carolina because they're looking for jobs. There are some other immigrants that might be, many of them, by the way, overstay their visas. So they arrive in North Carolina or other states legally, as students, let's say, or guest workers, and then instead of going home when they're supposed to, they sort of jump ship. So it's not just people sneaking over the border who are coming here illegally. In fact, more often it's people who come legally but don't leave when they're supposed to. So you put those two groups together, you've got a number of people who are here, and almost all of them are here because they see more economic opportunity here than they do at home. So while immigration imposes significant dislocations and even problems in our culture and our society, we should remember that we would be much worse off if we didn't attract immigrants. In other words, the problems of attracting immigration are also evidence that we're a place people still want to live. If we were a place that no one wanted to get into, that would actually be worse.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But anyway, I think that most of those immigration flows are going to be dictated by policies that Washington will set, that North Carolina really can control. On the margins, it matters. People do choose locations depending on not only the job opportunities, but whether they think it will be easier for them to live. So North Carolina has some ability to influence the immigration flow, but not very much. This is mostly a national concern. And nationally, if we look at a population of illegal immigrants in the 10 to 12 million range, out of a population well over 300 million, if we look at that population, it seems obvious to me that neither of the two poles of the immigration debate are realistic. Some people say, well, let's just legalize everybody who's here and make them citizens. That's not going to happen. They came here, the illegal population came here in violation of the law. They can't simply be offered citizenship. On the other hand, you have 10, 12 million people illegally in America, hundreds of thousands illegally in North Carolina. There's no plan or no prospect of a plan to simply send them all home, deport them. We don't have the resource. We don't have the police officers and law enforcement and immigration officers required to do something like that. Also, the border and the visa overstaying problem, they're both still there. So even if you deported millions of people, you'd have a flow back in. So you really have to figure out a strategy that on the one hand increases the enforcement mechanisms to ensure that when people come here, we know who they are and that they're headed for a job and they don't have a communicable disease and they're not on a terrorist wanted list. So we need to know who people are who are coming into the country. But I personally think it needs to be easier for people to legally immigrate to America, particularly if they have job skills that are in high demand or they want to create new businesses. I mean, there are lots of entrepreneurial immigrants. There are lots of high-skill immigrants, people who come in from India, people who come in from East Asia, people who come in from Europe who have high-level skills that are actually in demand in America, cannot be satisfied. So we're used to thinking about immigration as, well, it's farm labor, it's manufacturing labor, and of course there's a lot of that. But all the way up and down the labor market, from PhDs to high school dropouts, they're illegal immigrants.
So it's one of those things that one size does not fit all. And one of the things when we look at education and talking with some of the superintendents, I'm hearing from superintendents, we have some of our public schools now as much as 40, 50, even 60% that are immigrants, and of course most of those are Latino-speaking folks that are in the school system, which creates new challenges for education because teachers oftentimes find themselves trying to communicate with very intelligent people, but you've got a language barrier that's there. So these issues are something that, although it's, again, a federal issue, but the states have to address some of the outlying matters that are involved with that.
Well, that's true, and furthermore, the finances of immigration, the fiscal effects, differ at the scale you're looking. So if you look at the national level scale, immigrants are relatively young. Actually, most of them pay some kind of federal tax, usually federal payroll tax. But they're not eligible for Social Security or Medicare. So they are actually net pluses to the federal finances. So the federal government essentially makes money on many illegal immigrants. They get money from them. They don't have to pay them much of anything. But when you go to the state and local level, the financial picture changes a lot. Now you've got a situation where you might not be collecting, for example, state income tax on immigrants, and yet they're consuming some valuable services like public education or public health. So one reason why the issue is hard to address unless you do it at a national level is there probably has to be some sort of revenue sharing plan. There's some states that have high levels of illegal immigration, some that don't. The whole country, the fiscal model for Social Security and Medicare is helped by immigration, but that's not the case, for example, at public schools in North Carolina. We don't collect as much tax from immigrants as we're spending on their public education. So there needs to be some kind of addressing of that issue. either some sort of rebalancing process where the federal government kicks some money back to states that have high levels of immigration or something like that. Of course, you have to be careful. Just like a lot of things, this is a complex set of, it's sort of imagine a Rube Goldberg machine with lots of moving pieces. You don't want to create a situation where states want to be magnets for illegal immigration because they get more money from Washington. So you want to make sure that the incentive,
dependency role
you don't want to create a perverse incentive. But at the same time, as I said, you're not going to just legalize all illegal immigrants and make them citizens, and you're not going to deport 12 million people anytime soon. So you're going to have to do something in between that, in my view, offers a path to legal status for people who want to be here to work, not necessarily citizenship. Citizenship ought to still be pretty difficult for the illegal population to reach. Many, many years, study, fines paid, that sort of thing. Actually, most illegal immigrants are not interested in becoming U.S. citizens. They are Mexican citizens, they are Guatemalan citizens, they are Nicaraguan citizens. They want to be here to work. Often they send a lot of their money home to their families. And that's an important distinction to understand.
I think that's a good point, and many times I've had a discussion with folks that are in this country, and they will say, look, I'm here for one thing, to work, to move money back to my country of where I wish to live.
Yeah.
And we take the attitude, just because the person's here, that I guess it's some sense of pride and arrogance on our part as Americans that they must want to be part of the United States.
It's one of the subtle aspects of immigration policy is that if you made it easier for people to legally immigrate to America to work, you might actually reduce the population of illegal immigrants who stay here for a long time. See, once you get here, you're nervous. If you're illegal and you're in North Carolina, leaving is kind of risky. You might not get back.
That's right.
But what if you had a legal option to come back and forth? You weren't going to be a citizen, but you're going to have a legal option to come back and forth. Then you might actually stay here during the season and go home.
You just stake your claim as to what you wanted to do and what your intentions are.
I think that's going to be our long-term solution, but I recognize there are strong opinions about this issue.
One thing before we leave the whole issue of immigration, one of the things I think we've seen is this swaying toward enticing or getting involved with folks that are maybe Latino, that maybe there's been a missed market there for some of the politicos and political-based folks. Do you see that in North Carolina as well, that some of the politicians in North Carolina are now looking at that base as a voting population?
They are. Most Hispanics in North Carolina are not eligible to vote. And of the ones who are citizens and are registered to vote, their rate of voting is not very high.
So the percentage would be low anyway.
So right now, the Hispanic vote is not decisive necessarily unless you have a really close election in North Carolina. Now, in other states, obviously it is. If you're in a New Mexico or a Nevada or a Florida or a Texas and you're a Democrat or a Republican who can't effectively cultivate Hispanics, then you've got a real problem. And perhaps in the future, that's where North Carolina's headed. But right now, that's really not a big part of our politics. But
do you see that being part of it as folks become more and more part of the citizenry here, that maybe we're going to really look differently as a makeup of our political folks in office?
I think that there's no question in my mind that the share of North Carolinians of Hispanic ethnic origin will rise. But keep in mind that a lot of those future North Carolina citizens will be native born. They will be the children of illegal immigrants, and they will speak English. So the notion that, well, you've got to speak Spanish in order to attract votes from Hispanics is kind of missing the point. Lots and lots of people in the future will have Hispanic origins or Hispanic backgrounds. Their parents or grandparents will be from places south of the border, but they will consider themselves to be Americans and they will speak English.
And that will not be kind of a non-issue going forward. It'll kind of come together as a...
I don't know that it'll be a non-issue, truly, because think about it. You get 3 or 4 generations removed. You still have Irish Americans who think of themselves in a certain way, or Italian Americans. So you might have Mexican Americans who still have an ethnic pride, a reverence for the homeland, but they're Americans.
We're going to take another break. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with John Hood, the chairman of the John Locke Foundation in Raleigh. We hope you've tuned us in. If you're just tuning in, call a friend, tell somebody to tune in. Wish you know, we'll be back in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We Should Know is on the air. We're on WCLN 1170 AM, Star Vision Channel 16, Summation and the Sampson Weekly newspaper. We're bringing issues and subjects to you and information to you that you've asked about, talked about. We have John Hood, the chairman of the John Locke Foundation, with us today. Author, syndicated columnist, well known on Channel 5 for NC Spin, an excellent background in research and understanding what's happening in everything, John, from public policy right on around to education. You pretty much have done it with a deep-seated interest in history. And I find that very interesting because sometimes, you know, we run into the same ruts and we don't know that we're driving in the same ruts. We've done that before. I've seen it with education. Folks will come up and say, hey, I think we did that 20 years ago.
You can't really know where you are, and you can't project where you're going if you don't know where you've been. Absolutely. It's just a bottom line thing. And a lot of times people have political debates and they think they're having a new conversation. They're just having the same conversation the grandfathers had. And they need to know that. They need to know that perhaps these issues have not been just sort of arrived suddenly.
A wise man once told me, said, son, never forget your roots. And I found that to be very important going through my career. Now, I want to talk about something that, and a number of insurance folks, independent insurance people have mentioned this. One of those actually has a show on WCLN. Wayne Weeks mentioned this to me. There's a couple of bills, Senate Bill 154 and House Bill 265, and it's dealing with automobile insurance and this whole rate issue. Give us a quick and oversight issue and whatever in depth you want to lay out there about why we should be concerned about that and why it's important for us to be concerned, because these things now are matriculating through the Senate and the House.
Well, North Carolina has a fairly unique auto insurance system. Most states don't do anymore what we still do. We have something called a rate bureau. And the various auto insurers, and there are many auto insurers. Auto insurers is a very competitive business. All you have to do is watch TV during the NCAA tournament, and you will see commercial after commercial from auto insurers. That's how competitive it is. In North Carolina, they file. What happens is they all end up together in the rate bureau filing a set of rates, and they become the maximum rates, more or less. There's a few deviations, but they become the maximum rates, and then companies can deviate some off of that downward. But here's the thing about North Carolina. We got two things that make us that's one thing that makes us very different. Let me give you two more. One of them is that because we have that unified rate structure, a lot of the products that you see advertised during the basketball tournament are actually not legal in North Carolina. So there are various kinds of gimmicks or offerings where the company may say, for every year you have a safe driving record, we will give you a discount, or give you this, or give you that, or reduce your deductible. There are some other kinds of breaks like that. And they might sound very attractive to North Carolinians, but they're not available to us. In fact, you read the fine print on this commercial, they're not available in some states. They mean us. So there's not a lot of that kind of innovative rating and innovative deductibles interacting with driving records. And you know, there's one company that offers maybe more than one, that offers a discount if you will put a device in your car to register your driving record, because they're trying to gather data on their drivers. And if you're fairly clean and low risk, then you'll get a better rate. Can't do that in North Carolina either under the current system. Finally, we have a large number of drivers in North Carolina that are classified as high risk. They might not necessarily have accidents in their past, but they're high risk. And in other states, they would pay a higher rate. In North Carolina, they're all put into a reinsurance facility, and they don't pay as much of a rate increase as they otherwise would, a rate hike as they otherwise would. So essentially in North Carolina, we force relatively safe and low-risk drivers to subsidize the relatively risky drivers. And it's not a huge amount of money, but it is money that flows disproportionately from, let's face it, older people and women to younger people and men, like my son, who just got legal to drive. So those are the reasons why North Carolina is different. So the bills in the legislature would try to move some of those policies closer to other states. Okay? Now the pushback is significant. Some insurance companies like the idea of bringing these innovations into the market, but other insurance companies, particularly companies that already have a large amount of the North Carolina market, they don't want anything to change because they think they might lose customers. So some insurers want these changes, some insurers don't. There's also the basic bottom line argument, and Wayne Goodwin, who's the Commissioner of Insurance, argues, why are we messing with this? North Carolina has some of the lowest average auto insurance rates in the country. He's absolutely right about that. And it's difficult to get people exercised about the auto insurance system if they feel like they're not having to pay very much. Now the problem with that argument is that the whole southeast region has relatively low rates. And even in parts of North Carolina's auto insurance market, like commercial vehicles, who are not governed by the system, they also have among the lowest rates in the country. It's likely that our rates are low because of our population density and the age of our auto fleet and lots of other things that don't really have to do with the regulatory system. But it admittedly, even though I like these ideas that are in the legislature, admittedly it's difficult to argue for change when North Carolina's rates are consistently in the bottom 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the country. It differs by the year. So I think that there is some interest in this. There are some parts of the industry that want change in North Carolina. There are also insurance companies that don't want any change because I think they might lose market share to some of these innovative products.
The commissioner, Wayne Goodwin, of course, has been here a couple of times. I think his thing is if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. It's working well. In the sense of what you look at as an overall statistical issue, do you think that's pretty sound advice, or do you think people should get on their phones and call their legislators, or what?
If you have a poor driving record or you're a high-risk driver, you probably like the current system in North Carolina a lot. If you're a fairly low-risk driver, you drive the speed limit or less, you don't have accidents, you're older, you pay more than you should have to. So it depends on who you are as to whether you can see these insurance reforms in Raleigh being in your interest or against your interest.
And with the history of driving, even if you are older and have an excellent driving record, with the traffic on the road now, you could be involved in an accident and your insurance go up. So you might want to lean to that conservative side and keep it where it is.
You might, but in general, you're going to save money if we change North Carolina's system to be like other states. But again, if you're a high-risk driver, you'll probably lose money.
Depends on where you're at.
Yeah.
Let's move to another part of insurance, talk about that a bit. And I think we've been around the table here, I know, with this show a number of times with, again, the insurance commissioner, some of his staff, before we really got into the implementation of the National Health Care Bill. This bill obviously now is implemented. It seems from what I can read and understand, it's gone from like 9 pages now to about 10,000, 12,000 pages. Continues to grow voluminously. Are we too far down, quote, the rabbit hole with this thing? Is there any turning around? Is there any slowing down? What do you see, and what's the impacts for North Carolina?
I don't think that the architecture of the Affordable Care Act will be fully repealed. I mean, it won't just disappear one day and we'll say, hey, what happened to health care reform? That's probably not the end game here. However, I don't think it will stand in its current form either. I don't think that the current reliance on Medicaid expansion by states for people of near poor incomes and poor incomes, combined with these heavily regulated state insurance exchanges where private plans are available, I don't think that structure can survive in its current form. It's simply too costly. They underestimated the cost and overestimated the revenues. They haven't thought through the implications and the interactions between those two pieces of the plan. Also, I think they haven't yet begun to see the unpopularity. People are vaguely aware and not very happy about Obamacare. But as they learn more about it, they're going to get more unhappy. The early things that happened were fairly uncontroversial. 26-year-olds can be on their parents' policy. That's not a very big deal, and it's sort of vaguely popular. But when you start seeing premium increases for young people in the individual market of 60, 70, 80, even 100%, you see the small group market in North Carolina see 30, 40% or more premium increases next year, in 1 year. That's going to be really unpopular. People are going to get really upset about that. And as larger employers who are currently grandfathered and can keep their current plans, as they start to try to adjust the plans and come under the jurisdiction of Affordable Care Act, they're going to be unhappy. So there's going to be a lot of unhappiness. There's going to be some changes, I hope significant changes in the system, probably not under President Obama, but whoever whoever the next president is, Democrat or Republican, I think will sign significant changes in this bill that don't really go all the way to repeal, but there'll be a significant rewrite.
Are you seeing a number of the physicians that are, in actuality, a lot of physicians are in private business, is what it amounts to. Some of these physicians, whether private business or part of a large health conglomerate, there seems to be some pushback from their perspective, too, as it relates to certain tests they would like folks to receive. Now some of the physicians are saying to me, these tests now are being very, very scrutinized. I'm having to call in for someone maybe with a high school education doing a checkoff list on something I need to do for John Hood, and I'm seeing myself being checked back, and Are you hearing that as well?
Yes, you got to do something to deter high utilization of care. If doctors and patients were making decisions and neither had to worry about how much it cost, then we would never be able to solve the problem. So it's not a good idea to have bureaucrats telling doctors what to do, but it's also not a good idea to have health care operating on a blank check. So you have to have something else, and in my view where that's going to go is we're going to limit insurance coverage, which we should. We should raise the deductibles dramatically. People ought to be paying cash for routine medical expenses so that patients and doctors make the decision on the basis of whether patients think it's worth to spend $200, $300, $500. There's nothing magical about health insurance. It doesn't mean that something no longer costs $500. It just means that a $50 copay only covers 10% of the real cost. You end up with a lot more utilization than you need. So we need a system that's patient-centered, which inevitably then gives doctors the freedom to practice, but in the same time limits health insurance to truly major medical conditions, thousands and thousands of dollars of expenditure. It should be more like other kinds of insurance and less like prepaid health care.
But it's just in our conversation, it appears it's going to be somewhat of a bumpy road for the next few years until this thing settles down.
Health care is going to be one of our most controversial issues for years to come.
Well, we're going to continue this discussion as we move forward today. There's a number of issues I want to talk about, and one of those I wanted to touch on very quickly, and maybe we can get just your quick comment in on charter schools before we go to break. We've got about 15 seconds.
Charter schools are a given. I don't think they're going anywhere. There's now an unlimited cap or unlimited number of charter schools available. I think that they will grow as a share of our education market.
We're going to go to our next break, and we'll be back in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, with John Hood with the John Locke Foundation. This is We Should Know. Stay with us. Call a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The name of the show is We Should Know. We want to thank all of our folks out there that listen to us. A number of folks talk about our show on their show. Boogie Shoes, Robert Stroud, Wayne Weeks, Don Smith with the Country Store also talks about us, and of course Grandpa Pat also mentions us quite frequently, and we appreciate all of those comments. We're coming to you on WCLN 1170 AM radio, Star Vision Channel 16. We appreciate you listening today. A number of issues we're talking about, and we're talking to John Hood with the John Locke Foundation, the chairman of that organization, a huge think tank. Most folks in North Carolina hear that name, they know that there's substance there, and there's been some research done. You've got a pretty big staff there that looks at data, looks at information, compares the historical impact with the reality of today. John, we were talking off break and on break. One of the things that interests me, and I think it does you a bit too, is there's so many issues facing folks in North Carolina and the country. Mostly what we get is what the bird's eye view of that TV camera reveals, or maybe a bold print on the top of a headline of a paper. Give us your sense of that. Sometimes I think maybe we zero in too much on some subjects and we miss something that's really important.
Well, what I would say to that is that it's called the agenda setting function. So years ago there was research in communication circles about the agenda setting of newspapers, that they would measure how often things were in headlines, how often things were at the front of newscasts, and then they would measure that against subsequent political campaigns, for example, and they would see a relationship. So the media was able to set the agenda, not necessarily tell everybody what to think. Sometimes we give too much power to the media. We're sort of imagining that they're brainwashing people, and that's not really how it works. But they did have a very strong agenda-setting power. Now, frankly, that power has been eroding for about 15 years because the Internet came along, people began to have alternative sources of information, and for national affairs and international affairs, the media's ability to set the agenda is much less than it used to be because they have all these other sources. So there are people, even though the headlines were about one thing, somebody on the Internet told them that North Korea was going to nuke California, and they got all upset about it and asked their friends, and there was an elaborate conversation about an issue that did not get any attention in the New York Times or the Charlotte Observer or whatever. However, so while that's weakening at the national level, I would argue that agenda setting is still happening a lot at the state and local level. Think about it. There aren't as many websites and alternative media going on in reaction to North Carolina government or local government. So you still have TV stations and newspapers playing a very large role in setting that agenda. And that's one of the reasons why the John Locke Foundation, we publish our own newspaper, because then we get to set the agenda for our readers. And that's what we do. Our front pages do not often match the Raleigh paper or the Wilmington paper or the Charlotte paper or the Sampson Independent or anything else. It doesn't always do that. And so our goal is to put some ideas on the table that people may not have heard about or not have thought much about. We also have an opinion about them, but even if they disagree with us, at least they're thinking about something different and important.
I think it's important that we bring that out as we talk about some of these issues today, because that's really where we're going. And having said that, I want to move, because we are kind of in our last segment here, and I'd love to have you for 2 or 3 hours to talk, but the big issue now on the national level is gun control. And as you have seen, Mayor Michael Bloomberg up in New York City, $12 million, I'm told, of his own money that is campaigning, and I'll use the word campaign, on gun control issues right here in North Carolina. And I recently saw one of the ads. A young man appeared to be somebody that could have been easily found right here in eastern North Carolina with a shotgun or a long gun of some kind laying across his lap, talking about the importance of guns and that there was no intent of removing guns and that folks needed to calm down and all these kinds of things. Give us some of your sense of what in the world is going on when you got the mayor of New York City spending, although he's a billionaire, I understand, spending $12 million of his own money. Where is that agenda, and what is behind that? I mean, I've been kind of peeling that potato. I can't find the issue there with it.
I assume that Michael Bloomberg really believes what he's saying, just like on the trying to ban Big Gulp soda pop. Okay, he really believed that was a good idea. It was a horrible idea, but he thought it was a good idea. It was unpopular. I think similarly, gun control, people react to these horrific incidents that usually occur around someone with a mental illness.
Absolutely.
And they react to that by saying, let's do something about all these machine guns that they have. So they spend all this time and effort working themselves into a frenzy about why do private citizens need to have the right to machine guns? Because they're mowing people down with their machine guns. Well, so that goes on for a while, and then the public who doesn't really get plugged into this issue plugs into it, and then somebody says, machine guns are already illegal, right? So we're talking about semi-automatic weapons that fire one time every time you pull the trigger, and the reason they differ from a standard hunting rifle is because they're shaped differently, but that's about it. So I think that Mayor Bloomberg's efforts, like previous efforts, will peter out, and they'll probably help the National Rifle Association more than it hurts them. I think gun control for Democrats is always a disaster. There are issues that Republicans go after that are unpopular. It always hurts them when they do it. And the same is true with Democrats and gun control. They always get kind of seduced into going after gun control. Well, now's the time. They always get beat. I think they'll get beat again.
And I think there's a certain social dynamic there. It's, can a person really relate in an urban setting to a person in a rural setting in their understanding of a weapon, a long gun or a pistol, compared to somebody in an urban setting? Is there a lack of relationship there? You look at the senators and debating this subject. The folks from South Carolina, versus somebody from New York, you can see that kind of glazed look when the guy from South Carolina says something about, I have one of those and I shoot it every 2 or 3 weeks, and he looks at him like, what? The
fundamental problem here is the problem of what is your default opinion about government's power. Lots of people who favor gun control, they really, I know many of them, I debate them all the time. They get really angry when I say, well, people ought to have the right to whatever gun they want, as long as it's not a military weapon, it's not a bazooka or a machine gun. And they say, well, why does anybody need? Justify for me why anybody would need a gun with a magazine of more than 10 rounds. And my answer to them is, I don't have to justify anything. You have to justify why it makes any difference whether a kid who wants to kill people, unfortunately because he's got a mental illness, if he has a magazine of 30 rounds and he shoots off 30 rounds, or he has 3 magazines of 10 rounds and it literally takes about a second to pull the magazine out, stick another one in, what difference does it make? Show me that it makes any difference at all. So a lot of this has to do with what is your assumption. Your assumption is that citizens have to prove the reason why they need a right, or is your assumption is that government needs to prove a reason why it needs to infringe a right? If you're in the latter camp, you don't even have to be interested in guns to be resistant to gun control.
And to Bloomberg's ad, it basically alleges that by doing this, by what he's asking to be done in that ad, that it will do away with illegal handguns, and it will allege that it will do away with folks that unfortunately have the mental substance to do what was done at Newtown. So it alleges that, and there's no credence to that at all.
No. If you want to address troubled youth and troubled adults, mm-hmm. Who feel suicidal and homicidal, then you need to do it through the mental health system. It's not about guns, and the whole idea that you can pass a law to get rid of illegal handguns kind of misses the point. If they're already illegal and they're still available, that tells you the limits of law in a big, sprawling country like America to tell people what to do. It's not going to work. It never works. We need to focus our attention on things that actually have a practical effect on real life, not just symbolism.
Speaking of practical effects, there's a couple of issues I want to try to dust off here quickly, right. and maybe we can do this kind of a shotgun approach, sure. Since we're talking about guns.
Rapid fire.
Rapid fire here. Same-sex marriage. What's going on there? Obviously, North Carolina citizens has voted. We know where we stand. But there's now obviously this issue, as you've seen in the Supreme Court. Look, we're going to make it happen anyway. What's the deal with that?
I think this issue is a generational issue, honestly. I think in 20, 25 years, even if nothing happens at the federal level, North Carolina will legalize some kind of same-sex civil union or marriage.
Okay.
Because that's where the young people are.
I think you're probably right, and I think statistically that's movement. But still, I think we've got to look at the numbers. The numbers of folks still look at it as states that have supported this, well over 60%. Man and a woman. So I mean, I think we come down to the legal issue. Is really critical here, and there are folks that say, well, leave this up to the faith-based organizations.
Well, yes, let churches marry whomever they wish,
absolutely.
But I would think states should be able to decide marriage policy, but I think most states will end up accommodating same-sex partners.
Still dealing with a lot of issues on excessive spending and taxation. I know this is a whole subject we could talk about it for an hour. Taxation, a small group of us were talking the other day, not really a think tank, we were just trying to think, I guess. But when you take $1 and you take away all the taxes that come out of that dollar, even the fees that offered and levied that end up being taxes, there's not but like 20 to 40% left out of that dollar.
Well, it depends on your income level and what you're doing in life, but certainly the average federal, state, and local tax burden on a North Carolinian would be somewhere between a quarter and a third of their income. Mm-hmm. For people who are higher income, it might be 40% or higher. I think North Carolina needs tax reform. I think it should reduce our marginal rates of income taxation and make us more competitive and create more jobs. If tax reform doesn't create economic growth and jobs, it's not worth doing.
Well, we're kind of coming down to the wire. I want to give you some time from your basket of things you want to look at. I've hit you with a number of issues today, and I know some of those you want to talk about anyway. But from where you sit, and from the author of this book and many others, and a lot of the things you do in the state, what are a couple of the quick concerns that you want us to look at? And I'll let you kind of wrap things up.
There are so many specific issues that we could talk about. But a better way to think about it in the short time left is there's a fundamental question that North Carolinians have to ask themselves. What kind of state do they want to live in? Do they want to live in a state that has greater freedom? That includes the freedoms for some people to prosper and some people who make mistakes and have to live with that. That's the kind of question they have to answer for themselves. I favor more freedom and let people learn from their mistakes, but others don't. And that's really the crux of what the political disagreements are about.
And it gets back to that agenda, I think, John, of less government, more business, yes. Empowering business, empowering ownership.
It's all about ownership of assets. People need to have more responsibility, be able to accumulate assets over the course of their lives, not be dependent on government or anybody else as much as they are now.
And for more information, you can go to the John Locke Foundation online. And I want to thank you again for taking time to be with us, and I also invite you to come back and let's talk about other issues. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching We Should Know. We've been talking with John Hood with the Locke Foundation. We'll see you again next week on the radio.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question or comment regarding this or any episode, please send your email questions and or comments to jwsimmonsedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday afternoon beginning at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.